We didn't finish last week's lesson. We'll pick up with the last point in it and then continue in tonight's lesson. It's possible we won't finish tonight. We'll finish it all in our last class on Friday night. I hope to do that. And there may be a possibility that I'll write a couple of appendices to this whole thing that I'll send out later on topics that I think I haven't had time to address. I think people would be interested in, but we'll see how that goes. But again, glad to have everyone here tonight. If you have a question or a comment, the chat window is available. You can click on chat at the bottom of the screen. The chat window will come up that you can make comments in or questions. And you can unmute your own microphone down in the lower left corner and ask to make a comment or ask a question. Be glad for you to do that. All right, well, let's get started tonight. We are into the middle of the 20th century. And being in the middle of the 20th century, we are looking at already another division that's taking place within the churches of Christ. We are seeing the church change in its makeup. It's becoming much more of a middle class to upper middle class group of people. And as that happens, we begin to see it being influenced by the society itself, as usually happens to us. The views, outlooks of the society around us, the success or the lack of success financially in the economy affects the viewpoint of Christians and churches also. And that's what's happening here. As we become more middle class, we become more interested in the things that middle class is interested in. Better income, better education, more contact with the world in general through education and better paying jobs and being in corporations and businesses. All of that is changing an outlook that is bringing the church again closer to the way the world thinks. And last week we talked about those changes in attitudes, moving from alienation to acceptance, from looking at the church as something that's separate from the world, that's never going to be accepted by the world, that we're strangers and pilgrims here, we cannot be drawn in by the world, to wanting to be accepted by the world, wanting to be a church that's second to none, that's right up there with the other churches, and willing to make compromises, to be identified with them, to engage in works with them, moving in that direction within society. And then also the emphasis, the change in emphasis from that what this is all about in the church is preparing for the life to come, to rather the emphasis being upon the here and now. And that the church, as it becomes involved in the community, thinks its main role is to solve all the community's problems and its social ills. And so that changes also. Along with all of this comes institutional growth. These churches begin to look to organizations to help carry out these social roles or goals that it has. And so institutions do develop and grow to help meet these. And these involve colleges and secondary schools, daycare centers, homes for the aged, child care institutions, a wide variety of things to carry these things out. And institutions begin to play a major role in what follows. And so as that happens, the role of institutions begins to be questioned as they begin to tie themselves to churches. And they begin to seek support from the church, or churches start an institution and plead for churches to support the institution that they started. And church treasuries now are being called upon to fund all these organizations during this time. The last point I had last week had to do with the role of religious journals. Journals fit in the classification of institutions. They are organizations that are committed to disseminating a message through print. And they are influential, had been from the very beginning of the Restoration movement. They are in any religious movement. And in the 1900s and into the mid 20th century, you see some that have particular strong influence. Religious journals can be a wonderful blessing in learning from good Bible students who are writing about things and challenging your thinking and those kinds of things. They can be very good. Religious journals usually have on their staff and even editors are well-known people in the brotherhood, maybe well-known preachers that travel through the country preaching. Maybe they're professors on colleges and one of the church colleges that write for, even edit some of these. And so they by nature of the institution, that is being an institution that means to disseminate a message, that can become influential throughout the brotherhood. They have to pay very close attention that they are not trying to build a party or a faction within the church. They must see their role as simply doing teaching and disseminating that teaching and challenging brethren on their thinking. But when they begin to advocate churches dividing and choosing sides, those kinds of things, you have to be very careful about that. Editors have great influence. And what's often given, many times given in journals and in books written about the churches of Christ in the 20th century, the example that's often given is that of the Gospel Advocate. The Gospel Advocate was easily the most influential journal among churches of Christ from the late 1800s into the 1960s. It had some very capable men in its leadership. But as this church is making its transition into being an acceptable church in the community, becoming a middle-class church, and all that goes with it, B.C. Goodpasture became the editor of the Gospel Advocate in 1937. He remains in that role until his death, which I believe was in 1977, I believe. And he becomes tremendously influential during a time period when there were very many controversial issues. Goodpasture was not known as a gospel preacher going through the country. He was a very able administrator and influencer. And most of what he did, other than in the journal itself, was work behind the scenes to use his influence. And he did that probably more effectively than any other editor journal. He's an example of what historians refer to as an editor bishop. That is, as an editor, he essentially served in the role as a bishop of the church, having that kind of influence. When the issues of the sponsoring church and the human support of institutions begin to rise, Goodpasture clearly chooses a side on these issues. And in time, makes a very clear line of demarcation, trying to separate from those who expressed the different views from what he had. So as he took the position of what really became the mainstream position among churches of Christ, of the support of human institutions, of the encouraging and sponsoring church arrangement, and other issues that are going to come along and match up with those, he begins to, as I say, very clearly draw a line of division between the two groups. Now, I don't want to hide the fact that there were those on the conservative side who were very acerbic in their writings, and I think had attitudes that were unbecoming. They were writing and defending a scriptural position, but they, just like some on the other side of the issue, made the issues personal too often. And that should not have happened. But nonetheless, what Goodpasture finally does is he decides to try to completely shut out the non-institutional group. And so he approves the practice of setting up what came to be called the yellow tag of quarantine, to be put on all those non-institutional brethren. That those brethren should be marked. They should not be hired to be preached or hold gospel meetings. They were not going to be allowed to write in the Advocate. All those things would be marked to preachers, and so would churches. And so by that, he, in drawing that line, very clearly made the division a reality. The result of it, interestingly, when he announced that, and of course the Advocate had this tremendous influence, that he ended up having what eventually came to be called the confessional column, which was where preachers would write in and confess that they had now seen the light and were changing their position. They would go from the non-institutional position to the institutional position. And there was a lot of pressure there. And I don't want to imply that all of them did that with motives other than having really changed their mind. But it's pretty obvious that many of them did, when the pressure was put upon them that they were going to lose their jobs, lose their preaching opportunities, all those kinds of things. There was a motivation, it seems to be, for many of them to make their confession. And when they did, good pastor would often commend these men for their courageousness and recommend them to the brotherhood to hold gospel meetings or to hire them as preachers, that these were fine men. And the influence the good pastor had through doing this was tremendous. And many changed their position during this time as a result of all that was happening. So the widespread influence of this journal, the Gospel Advocate, and its editor, B.C. Goodpasture, played a tremendous role in turning much of the mainstream toward the position of institutionalism and eventually of really the social gospel, in looking at that. That is just another illustration of how the attitudes are changing in the church. Now, the church is seeing its role change and beginning to add to the church organizations and institutions to do things that they were seeing the church itself could not do as a local congregation, incapable of doing it. Well, this certainly develops as we go into the next lesson in another issue that came up, which was the sponsoring church arrangement that we want to look at. Let me pause for a minute and see if anybody has a question or comment at this point before we go on. Okay. The concept of the sponsoring church is one where one church decides to do a work far beyond what it is able to do itself. And so, having decided to do that work, they solicit funds from other churches to send to them so that they can do this work, what in their view is a brotherhood-wide work for all the churches. The church became the sponsoring church for whatever they were doing, and all other churches sent their funds to the sponsoring church, in essence, casting their funds into that church treasury so that that church then could do this large nationwide or worldwide work. That's the concept. And after World War II, so many of these soldiers came back, having seen an entirely different world, far beyond their hometowns, far beyond their area or region. Seeing a world out there, especially where they had been, that truly needed the gospel. The war-torn countries of Europe, of Japan, of Italy, all these having been affected and destroyed, and countries also affected, the Philippines and other places like this, they've been to a great extent destroyed by the war. They saw as opportunities for the preaching of the gospel. And it was true. It was really true. It was an opportunity. It was a great opportunity that needed to be taken advantage of. A world evangelistic outlook had not been that strong in Churches of Christ before World War II. And that will change dramatically after the war. But the solution that many saw for doing this was that the only way we're going to be able to do something that large is to form a larger organization or institution to do this. The ability to do this was greatly enhanced by the fact that the church now had a whole lot more money than it did back in the 20s and 30s, pre-war times. Of course, the church had gone through the Depression in the 30s. But post-World War II, America was booming. Its economy was booming. And people were, to a great extent, flush with money in comparison to what it had been before World War II. And treasuries and churches and contributions leaped tremendously during that time. And so the money was available to do the kinds of things that were being suggested by some in planning these nationwide or worldwide works. The Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas, one of the two largest churches of Christ in the country at that time, under the leadership of its preacher, G.C. Brewer, extremely popular preacher during that time, said that they were going to take on evangelizing Europe. Even before the war was over, they were wanting to do that. Of course, that local church couldn't do that. And so his plan was to have other churches send their funds to Broadway. Broadway would make this grand plan to evangelize Europe and execute it, and everyone could send the money to them. Now, again, the sponsoring church arrangement was not something that was brand new. In a much smaller form, it had been around for a while. You can go back into the early 20th century and see examples of it on more of a local scale. You might have a group of churches in an area that want to support a preacher evangelizing somewhere. They didn't pool their funds, but they would pass around to the different churches, taking turns supporting that man. And that's a form of church cooperation. I don't know anything's wrong with that. But a more common form was they wanted to have a large gospel meeting in a town or in an area, and maybe back then, large tent meetings or something like that. And the churches in the area would want to do that together, and they would pool their funds. And one church would take on the responsibility of all the nuts and bolts of it, the administrative end of it, and those churches would send their money to that church to help meet the bills to carry that out. And so in that small way, there were examples of church cooperation. But the principle in that second one was the same as what we're going to see in these worldwide plans. Really, what you see after World War II is the first idea of taking this to a whole nother level, of trying to do this on nationwide and worldwide scale. And the Broadway Church wanted to do that. And Brewer makes the specific plea of saying, we want to do what individual churches cannot do by working on their own. And if you remember, that's the exact same argument Alexander Campbell made to justify the American Christian Missionary Society, saying just one Christian cannot do what a local church can do. One church cannot do what a whole group of churches can do. And therefore, the need to set up an organization or society to do things on a grand scale. That's exactly the same thing, the same argument that's being made here in this. The Union Street Church in Memphis takes on evangelizing Japan. Another church starts sending ministers to Italy. There end up being several different churches taking on specific countries in Europe and in other places. And they would be sponsoring the evangelism for that country. And they would all be out soliciting funds from churches for their particular country and for their evangelist. This became a widespread practice. I mean, it exploded. There were sponsoring churches all over the place. And what happens in the sponsoring church arrangement, each church having its own special program underway, many of those going around, what often happened was one church would want to take part in some program this church had over there, and this had funds to it. And that church over there wanted to take part in a program over here at the church had just sent them money, so they could say they're having a part in that program, and they'd send money back. And you'd have Church A sending money to Church B, and Church B sending money to Church C, and Church C sending money back to Church A. When you began to tie all these churches together in these kind of programs, it's the kind of thing that happens. And the number of sponsoring church programs over the next decade or so just became almost innumerable among brethren. It's the same kind of sponsoring church organization that was also used to build something I discussed in a sidebar last time, the Herald of Truth radio program, later TV program. The Highland Avenue, Fifth and Highland Church in Abilene, Texas, decided they were going to sponsor a nationwide radio program. And they finally reached an agreement with ABC to put it on 30-something stations. You got to remember, this is the early 1950s. There's not hundreds of stations. And, but they couldn't afford it. And they immediately sent out a fervent, urgent appeal for churches to send to them so they could do this. And they could be doing the same things that all the denominations had been doing. They need to hear the Church of Christ on the radio like they hear all the others. And what a great evangelistic opportunity it is. And so all the churches began to send to support that. Now, the real issue in all of this, in evangelizing in this way or any other program done in that way, the question was not whether we ought to be evangelizing the world. Everybody wanted to do that. All churches wanted to see that done and accomplished. The question was, what is the scriptural way to do this? How can it be accomplished? Sometimes our grand schemes and our optimism can get us carried away in doing things that really aren't authorized, but we think this is such a grand idea. Surely it's fine. The issue wasn't whether to evangelize, it was the way to do it. And the fact of the matter is, there is no pattern for the sponsoring church in the New Testament for tying churches together in any way whatsoever. It is exactly the same principle that you find in the American Christian Missionary Society issue back in the 1850s. Churches pooling their funds into one organization, and then that organization making the decisions about how the work is to be carried out. The American Christian Missionary Society decided where where evangelism would be done, what preachers were going to be sent there, how much they would be paid. All that was determined by them. The only real difference that I see between that and the sponsoring church is you just swap the board of the American Christian Missionary Society for a board of elders in a local church. Because the sponsoring church, like at Broadway in Lubbock, basically took in all the funds. It executed the plan, deciding where the preachers would go, who the preachers would be, what they would be paid, when they would come back, all those kinds of things. Broadway determined that. They made that decision. The local churches essentially gave up that part of their autonomy. The scriptural pattern, very clearly in Scripture, is that a congregation has a direct relationship with the evangelists that they support. The biblical pattern is that evangelists who go out into the world can be supported. The Apostle Paul was supported by several churches, but they all were sending directly to them. He had a personal relationship with them. And that is the way it was accomplished. That's the biblical pattern. And if you think that's very limiting, just remember, in the first century, the entire world was evangelized in one generation without a single sponsoring church or pooling of funds organization. it is still possible in any generation. It just means that individual Christians have to take upon themselves the responsibility to do that and to see that their local church is committing itself to evangelizing the world and supporting preachers in other places. That's the biblical way. It worked in the first century. It can work in any generation. We have to think in terms of what the scriptures actually say about it. Well, as this middle-class church began to want to, again, do things they'd seen the denominations doing, starting all these programs, building organizations, building institutions from homes for the aged, child care institutions, to hospitals. They didn't build hospitals in America. They built them overseas. And there are many Church of Christ hospitals in countries overseas that churches here support, but they don't seem to want to do that in this country much. I think they would still recognize there'd be some opposition to it. But other organizations like that or institutions, they see the denominations doing that. They think they are doing a better job than we are. We need to do what they're doing. I really think that's much of what happens. And the consequences of all that is that although in the beginning, both sides of the issue were trying to make scriptural arguments, in time, when you can't really justify or point to the scriptures for what you're doing, in time, you begin to really play down that there is a pattern in the New Testament for it. And began to make the same kind of argument that the missionary, that the Christian churches began to make, for example, for instrumental music. Well, the Bible just doesn't talk about it, therefore it must be fine to do it. I know it has singing. We have the example of singing to worship God in the New Testament, but it doesn't say not to use instrumental music. It's not addressed. Brethren began finally to make the argument, well, I know in the New Testament that you have that pattern of supporting the preacher directly, but it really doesn't say anything about a sponsoring church arrangement. So he left us freedom to do that. It's exactly the same argument. And in time, the influence of saying we've got to give book, chapter, and verse for something begins to fade, and it will have a tremendous effect. These two groups are clearly divided by the time you get to 1960 and in the early 1960s. There's clearly a difference. And what has happened is this division over really how you view the scriptures. Whether you're going to be a literalist in interpreting the scriptures or you're going to just take it more figuratively or symbolically. Richard Hughes is a highly regarded religious historian. He's written many books and papers related to this. Hughes is actually one who would be very comfortable in the very progressive wing of the churches of Christ. We'll look at that more progressive idea in a little bit, but he's very comfortable with that. Does not see a need for a specific biblical authority for what the church practices, and that the church really should be a social action organization involved in the community, that's really what it's all about. But in his book called Reviving the Ancient Faith, he makes an interesting observation after he's discussed these issues, and I put the quote in the lesson on page 93. He said, the mainstream churches of Christ, time and again, would characterize those who opposed institutionalism as unfaithful to the heritage. Well, that is the heritage of the Restoration Movement. The truth is that the dissenters stood squarely in one of the footprints of the 19th century churches of Christ. And by the time the battle over institutions was complete, it was the mainstream, not the dissenters, that had removed itself almost entirely from its 19th century roots. Now, he's making very clear, as an impartial historian, what had happened. that really the concept of speaking where the Bible speaks and being silent when the Bible is silent was something that was being adhered to by those opposing institutions. And the mainstream that supported them and the other things that went along with it, he said, really had left that principle. And that's true. It really is. If you're going to say the Bible is our true final authority, then there is a pattern for evangelism, and there is a pattern for how church does benevolence. And you either accept the pattern or you don't. And they didn't want to be limited to it. And so they moved on, and they began then to move toward a view of maybe we're not so bound by book, chapter, and verse as we think we should do. I was involved in moderating a debate on these issues back in the 1970s. It was a debate that was carried on a very good level. A lot of debates weren't, but Dave Bradford was debating. And I remember the man who was defending the institutional position said several times, well, you know, there's many things we do that we really don't have Bible for. And I couldn't believe he was saying this, but he said it over and over. And it was an attitude that had clearly developed during that time. It really had. So this line is drawn. Things have changed. And you know, the vast majority go with the mainstream, just as had happened with the division of Churches of Christ and Christian churches. The vast majority then went with the Christian church. Churches of Christ were very small, less than 15%, that stayed conservative, and that kind of thing. All right, let me look at a couple of questions we have, or comments. Tim says the Bible. Wait a minute, let me roll back up here. The Bible never refers to an alliance or group of congregations that have banded together to do a work. The idea that the local church is a part of a larger working unit is incorrect. Robert Turner said in an article in 1962, when we say organizational structure begins and ends with the independent congregation, we mean there is no divine authority for a collection of Christians that is an organized unit larger or smaller than the local church. This is where no authority for a plurality of churches to act collectively. Yeah, that's earlier Tim, I discussed about how the universal church is made up of individuals, not congregations. And this exactly is what Robert Turner is getting to. Robert Turner is one of my favorite authors, one of my favorite men from his generation. And Turner is referring to this idea that people think of the church being made up as local congregations. And when you begin to think is you need an organization that ties congregations together, then you're creating an organization larger than the local congregation. And there isn't one in the New Testament. It's just not there. And that's what we have to be careful about. There, as he says, there is no authority for a plurality of churches to act collectively, and that's right. Someone asks, are you saying that it is unscriptural for a congregation to have a radio program, even if it's not supported by a multitude of churches? I remember Tampa Church of Christ had a weekly program where you could call in and ask questions. I don't see this as a bad thing. No, a local church can do that as its own work. I was on a call-in radio program for several years in Shelbyville, Tennessee, while I preached there, and took part in weekly radio programs preaching, and visited on some. I was on a call-in TV program when I was in Florence, Alabama. A local church doing that, that's part of its evangelistic work and can do that. The problem was not preaching on the radio. The problem was a church trying to solicit funds from all the other churches to do a work beyond its own ability to do. That's really what I'm talking about there. Yes, there's no problem with radio programs at all. There's not any problem with the church putting out a religious journal or a bulletin that it does on its own. But when it begins to solicit funds from other churches so it can do that on a scale far beyond what it can do on its own. It's tying churches together, and that's what happens. So that's what I'm talking about there. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? Let's talk about something else that's happening. There's a tremendous change that happens in the culture and as a result in the churches in the 1960s. Now, that's my generation. I come out of high school and go into college in the 1960s. I graduated from high school in 1968. And this was at the height of the protests concerning the Vietnam War. The pill had been invented and changing the whole society's view on sexual mores. There was widespread protests. There was racial unrest, and the explosion of recreational drugs to open up your mind, to open up your mind and look at things in a totally different way. All these things had an influence upon the culture about how things were dealt with. Some of these were things that certainly the society needed to hear. I'm not trying to put in here that, for example, there's something wrong with racial unrest that needs to be addressed in the right way. But it was certainly at its height during the 60s. I lived during the time of the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And all of that was a reflection of the unrest in the country during that time. And it raised a generation, or produced a generation, whose moorings to the mores and the authority of society were totally broken. That the idea developed that everyone was an authority to their own. Everybody decided for themselves. Nobody was to judge anybody else. And everyone could do what they wanted to do. You just didn't say anything about it. That really attitude begins to spread during this time. It is also a time where the church and this young generation becomes very interested in the social issues of the day, of social injustice and racism and poverty. They're developing attitudes in these areas very different from their parents. Their politics was very different from their parents. Their parents had a very conservative outlook on politics. They were very involved in opposition to the spread of communism during that time. And believe it or not, there was strong opposition. I even remember this, even though I was only 10 years old. Strong opposition to John F. Kennedy being president because he was a Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic would have to answer to the Pope, and we didn't want our president having to answer to the Pope. There was a lot said about that during that time. The younger generation did not see that, was drifting from that attitude, because in colleges and universities, professors were working actually to set a generation free from what they saw as those limiting bounds being placed upon the mind and the body of the individual. So as these things come to the fore in the culture, a generation of college students, even among churches of Christ, are in the very middle of that, attending colleges and universities during that time. It's also now being seen on television, which is ubiquitous, and all that's been broadcast about that. But they see all of that, and they are already dissatisfied with what churches of Christ are becoming. They did see, and we're seeing the plea still being made to follow the New Testament pattern. We need to follow the New Testament pattern, and the emphasis was upon how one is saved, on the organization and work of the church and worship and no instrumental music and those kinds of things. And then for them, their view of the social issues was through institutional work and also to provide recreation for their kids and in the society. This young generation began to question the relevance of the appeal to primitive Christianity during that time. The concept of the church being alienated from society was one they totally rejected. They believed the church should be engaged with society and all these issues, these political and social issues that were going on during that time. And that should be what the work of the church is all about. That the church's local church should have at its foreground and what it sponsored and supported financially and otherwise were the social and political issues of the day. That's what it was about. And part of that reaction to mainstream churches during that time is they saw their own churches as having become the same thing as the denominations. They were in many ways very formal and liturgical in their worship. As far as the kids growing up, they seemed more concerned about their providing fun and games, good times and parties for the kids, and building facilities to do all that at the church building, and making sure that they had recreation, had softball teams and all that going on. And they get out into the culture and see these other issues and say, is that what the church is about? About fun and good times and looking at old practices from 150 years ago? And they rejected it. They began to see that really what Christianity should be about, or what the church should be about, are these new issues. And so there was a radical turn because of a radical movement now in the church turning towards social and political agendas as the work of the church and the work of the local church. So they viewed that the church should be about these issues, believing the church should be a force for social justice, for the elimination of poverty, for gender equality, for world peace. This is really what the church should have as its work. It's interesting that already before this separation was happening, that the growth in mainstream churches of Christ had almost stopped. And sociologically or historically, when you look at this, the reason for that is they began to emphasize evangelism less and less. Although there had been that institutional effort at world evangelism after World War II, there was less and less evangelism. And just like happened in the Christian church, the growth not only stopped, it began to decline. When you fail to emphasize evangelism, you're not going to grow. And there was a lot of writing about that. There were social scientists in Churches of Christ that did surveys that showed in these studies that was happening. And what they thought churches should be about was totally changing. All that had an effect. Well, this more progressive wing within mainstream churches began to grow. And so you began to see religious journals appearing, advocating this new progressive view. And the more progressive ones were even saying, we need to change our hermeneutic, which is a term that refers to how we interpret the Bible. We're using the wrong form of biblical interpretation. In other words, they were saying this concept of book, chapter, and verse just needs to go out the window. That's not what it needs to be about. So that idea is beginning to spread during this time. One of the organizations, though short-lived, that had a great influence on a college-age young adult generation during that time was an organization that was formed to mimic the denominational parachurch organization called Campus Crusade, established by Bill Bright. It evangelized on campuses, still exists. And Churches of Christ said, we ought to do something like that. And there was an organization that was started that was called Campus Evangelism. the Campus Evangelism Organization, solicited funds from all the churches and formed organizations on many college and university campuses around the country. Now, the teachers and the preachers involved in that were very much involved in this more liberal and progressive movement that emphasized getting involved in the social issues of the day and getting away from the old stand of following a biblical pattern. And a whole generation, thousands of young people were indoctrinated by that group during that time. And you see its influence for years to come as a result of that, as those students in the most formative years of their intellectual thinking and planning were having their minds filled with that. And so you have that happening. It's also happening on college campuses. That is, in Christian schools, as they were called, Church of Christ colleges. Many of the colleges and universities sponsored and supported by Churches of Christ are becoming quite successful, becoming quite large, having access to a lot of funds. And their college professors are now becoming more highly educated, going to highly regarded and respected institutions in their fields, and now coming back to teach at these colleges and universities. The universities are thrilled to now have PhDs that have gotten their PhDs from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Chicago, and have attended some of the most prestigious seminaries in the country to get their training in religious history and other areas like that. It's not unusual, shouldn't be thought unusual that the ideas that they are taught there are indoctrinated into them, and they come back and begin to teach in these colleges and universities. I think that was particularly true early on in Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, and then in Abilene Christian after that. Abilene Christian College, later to be Abilene Christian University, ended up with several of these types of professors on their faculty. And they began to teach these very liberal views. The result among many of the mainstream churches was outrage. And the college had to, not just them, but some other colleges, they had to fire some of them, or they were going to lose huge amounts of financial support. Or they at least had some of them agree to not write or expound their views publicly on campus. That keep them from doing it privately, and they did continue to do that. And the result was a total change in that view. If you go to Pepperdine, Abilene Christian, you go to David Lipscomb University today, the old concept of New Testament Christianity, primitive New Testament Christianity, is not even considered anymore. They are very much a part of a Church of Christ denomination. And churches, for the most part, are now, mainstream churches are associated with that kind of thinking and idea. You see the idea of not drawing lines of fellowship with the denominations becoming very strong. Many of you may remember Max Lucado, who 20 years ago or so, his writings were tremendously influenced in spreading that kind of idea. He had many New York Times bestseller books on religion that led him into that kind of thinking, eventually getting the name Church of Christ taken off of the building where he preached in, I believe it was in San Antonio, and opening it to anybody. Baptism didn't make any difference. And that becomes finally a common outlook among Churches of Christ. So the viewpoint of New Testament Christianity has changed completely. The denominational view of the church came to dominate and still dominates among mainstream Churches of Christ today. the seed that was sown back in the 60s by mainstream churches and into the 70s comes to fruition as these liberal ideas flood the mainstream churches and take it far astray from New Testament Christianity. I want us to talk about more to talk about the results of that and to see where churches of Christ are now in the 21st century. I'll try to wrap it up with that, and we'll do that next time. I actually did pretty much get through this lesson. I'm a little over. Well, any other questions or comments on this you'd like to make before we wrap up tonight? Let's see, Tim, is this an article that you posted? Is that where the quotation came from that you posted there?
That is correct. That is sourcing the quote.
Okay, is it is that available on the web? Should be, everything else is.
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, we might locate that and send that out. I'm sure that's an excellent article. As I said, Robert Turner was just an exceptional mind. Opened my mind to an understanding of the local church and the role of the church. All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, I hope this has been helpful. A lot of talking here. I hate it's more lecturing. I get wound up trying to get through. But I hope all this has given us insight and understanding. I hope you're using the handout, reading it, trying to digest what it says, and that'll help us in the discussion as we go along. All right? Okay, well then we'll wrap up. I appreciate all of you being here tonight and look forward to our getting together on Friday night.